"Ma'am, that seat is already taken." The voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It cut clean through the low hum of polite conversation, through the soft clinking of glassware, and the quiet shuffle of tailored suits settling into place around the long mahogany table. For a moment, no one moved. Not the assistants lining the walls, not the executives pretending to review documents on their tablets, not even the man at the far end who had just cleared his throat seconds earlier. Charlotte Whitmore didn't look up. She adjusted the sleeve of her ivory blazer, smoothed an invisible crease near her wrist, and leaned back into the leather chair like she had always belonged there. The chair. The one at the head of the table. The one with the nameplate that now lay face down on the polished surface, nudged aside as if it had never mattered. A faint reflection of the overhead chandelier shimmered across the table, catching the edge of that fallen nameplate before fading into stillness. Across the room, a few eyes shifted, quick and uncertain, then dropped again. No one wanted to be the first to acknowledge what had just happened. No one wanted to choose a side before they understood the stakes. Ethan Cole stood a few feet away, his posture relaxed, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He didn't rush forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even glance at the displaced nameplate. Instead, he watched her. Not with anger. Not with embarrassment. Just with a calm that felt almost out of place in a room built on power and perception. Charlotte finally looked up, her expression composed, almost amused, as if the interruption had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "If there's confusion," she said, her tone smooth, carrying easily across the table, "I suggest we resolve it quickly. We have a schedule to keep." A few quiet nods followed, hesitant, automatic. Someone near the middle adjusted their tie. Another pretended to scroll. The room wanted movement. It wanted direction. It wanted someone to confirm that everything was still under control. Ethan took a single step forward. The soft sole of his shoe barely made a sound against the carpet, but somehow it felt louder than anything else in the room. He stopped just beside the chair, close enough now that the overhead light brushed the edge of his shoulder, casting a faint shadow across the table. Charlotte tilted her head slightly, studying him, her eyes narrowing just enough to signal curiosity layered over certainty. "You must be new," she said, her voice carrying a hint of something colder now, something sharper beneath the polish. "Let me offer you a bit of advice." She gestured lightly to the room, to the polished wood, to the silent witnesses. "In spaces like this, people sit where they're meant to sit." A faint ripple moved through the room, not quite laughter, not quite agreement, but something close enough to both that it filled the silence for a second longer than it should have. Ethan didn't react. Not outwardly. The air shifted, subtle but undeniable, as if the temperature had dropped by a degree no one could measure but everyone could feel. He reached forward, not toward the chair, not toward the nameplate, but simply placing his hand lightly on the backrest, steady, unhurried. His reflection flickered across the polished surface of the table, distorted by the angle of the light, blending with the room itself. For a brief second, everything seemed suspended. The quiet. The expectation. The unspoken question hanging between them. And still, he said nothing. The silence did not break, it stretched, thin and fragile, like glass under pressure, and Ethan Cole let it stretch because he understood something the rest of the room did not. That power was not proven by volume but by timing, and timing required patience, and patience required control, the kind of control that could not be borrowed or performed, only earned. And he had spent years earning it in places far removed from rooms like this, places where the lights were not soft and flattering but harsh and fluorescent, where the floors were not polished wood but worn concrete, where every decision carried weight that did not disappear at the end of a meeting but followed you home and waited for you at the door the next morning. And now he stood here, steady, unmoved, while Charlotte Whitmore sat in a chair she believed defined authority, her posture flawless, her confidence rehearsed, her gaze fixed on him with the quiet certainty of someone who had never been forced to question her place in a room like this, and around them the executives shifted almost imperceptibly, a chair leg scraping softly against the floor, a pen clicking once before being set down, a breath held just a second too long, small human signals that something was off even if no one was willing to name it yet, and Ethan noticed all of it without appearing to notice anything at all, his hand still resting lightly on the back of the chair, fingers relaxed, not gripping, not claiming, just present, and then his eyes moved, not to Charlotte, but briefly to the nameplate lying face down on the table, the engraved letters hidden now, reduced to a reflection, and for a moment that reflection caught the overhead light again, flickering like a quiet reminder of something unfinished, something unresolved, and then he looked back at her, calm, direct, without hostility, without hesitation, and when he finally spoke, his voice was even, measured, the kind of voice that did not ask for attention because it assumed it. "You are sitting in the wrong seat," he said, not loudly, not sharply, but clearly enough that every person in the room heard it as if it had been spoken directly to them, and this time the silence shifted, not thinner, but heavier, as if the weight had settled into the center of the table and no one could ignore it any more. Charlotte's expression did not change immediately, but something in her eyes tightened, just a fraction, just enough to register that this was no longer a passing interruption, and she leaned forward slightly, resting her forearms on the table, her tone still smooth but now edged with something firmer, something less patient. "I think you misunderstand how this works," she replied, and a few heads nodded again, quicker this time, more certain, as if aligning themselves with her restored a sense of order. "Positions are not decided by whoever walks in last," she continued, her gaze holding his. "They are decided long before anyone takes a seat." And there it was, the unspoken assumption made visible, the quiet hierarchy laid out in a single sentence, and for a second it seemed to settle the room, to give people something to hold on to, something that made sense within the structure they recognized. But Ethan did not move, did not argue, did not defend himself, and that lack of reaction created a new kind of tension, one that did not rely on confrontation but on absence, the absence of the response everyone expected, and it unsettled them more than anger would have, because anger they understood, anger they could respond to, but this calm, this stillness, this refusal to step into the role they had already assigned him, it left them without a script, without a clear next move, and Charlotte felt it too, even if she did not acknowledge it, her fingers tapping once against the table before going still again. And across from her, a senior executive cleared his throat, glancing between them as if searching for a signal, a cue, anything that would tell him how this moment was supposed to resolve, but none came, and the room remained suspended, caught between what had always been true and what might be changing, and in that suspended space, Ethan finally shifted, just slightly, enough to pull the chair back an inch, the leather whispering softly against the floor, not forceful, not aggressive, just inevitable. As if the movement itself had already been decided long before anyone noticed it happening, and still, his expression did not change. The chair moved another inch, then another, the soft friction against the floor barely audible yet impossible to ignore, and with each subtle shift something in the room began to unravel, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way certainty dissolves when it is no longer supported by reality, and Charlotte Whitmore felt it before she fully understood it, a flicker beneath her composure. A hesitation she had not allowed herself in years, because rooms like this had always followed rules. She knew by heart rules that had never failed her, rules that told her who belonged and who did not, who spoke and who listened, who led and who adjusted, and for a long time those rules had worked in her favor, reinforced by names, by networks, by a lifetime of never having to question whether the seat she chose would remain hers once she took it. But now, as the chair shifted beneath her, not by force but by quiet insistence, something unfamiliar pressed against that certainty, something she could not immediately categorize or dismiss, and around the table the executives began to notice it too, not in words but in posture, a straightening of backs, a stillness in hands that had been pretending to move, a collective awareness that this moment was no longer following the expected script, and one of the younger analysts near the far end glanced down at his laptop, then back up again, as if searching for confirmation in numbers or names that had not yet been spoken aloud, while another executive leaned slightly toward his neighbor, not speaking, just sharing the same unspoken question, and still no one intervened, no one redirected, because something about Ethan Cole made interruption feel premature. Like stepping into a sentence before it had reached its meaning, and he remained where he was, one hand resting lightly on the chair, the other at his side, his breathing steady, his presence grounded in a way that did not need validation from anyone else in the room. And when he spoke again, it was not to challenge, not to escalate, but to clarify, his tone unchanged. "This seat is assigned," he said, and the word assigned lingered, carrying more weight than the others, because it implied structure, decision, authority that existed beyond the visible moment. And Charlotte's lips pressed together for a fraction of a second before she allowed a small, controlled smile to return, the kind designed to reassert control without appearing defensive. "Assigned by whom?" she asked, her voice calm, but this time there was an edge of something sharper, something closer to insistence than certainty. And the question hung in the air, not because it demanded an answer, but because it assumed one, assumed that whatever authority he believed in would not withstand the scrutiny of the room, and for a brief moment it seemed to give people something to hold on to again, a familiar dynamic, a recognizable exchange. But Ethan did not answer immediately, and that pause, that deliberate silence, shifted the weight back again, because it suggested that the answer did not need urgency, that it existed whether or not anyone was ready to hear it. And across the table, the senior executive who had cleared his throat earlier finally reached for his tablet, tapping the screen with a little more force than necessary, as if trying to ground himself in something concrete, and then he stopped, his eyes narrowing slightly as he read something that had not been relevant a minute ago but now seemed to matter, and the change in his expression did not go unnoticed, not by the assistant standing behind him, not by the colleague seated to his left, and certainly not by Charlotte, whose gaze flickered toward him for just a second before returning to Ethan, and in that second, something shifted again, quieter this time, but deeper, like the first crack beneath a surface that had always appeared solid, and Ethan saw it, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with a calm recognition, because he had seen this moment before, not in this room, not with these people, but in different forms, different places, the moment when perception began to separate from truth, when the story people believed about power no longer matched the structure that actually held it, and he did not rush it, did not expose it too quickly, because timing, again, mattered, and so he simply reached down, picked up the nameplate from the table, and turned it over, placing it back in its original position with a quiet, deliberate motion, the engraved letters catching the light once more, clear, undeniable, present, and for the first time since the meeting began. No one in the room looked away. The nameplate settled into place with a soft, final sound that seemed louder than it should have been, the engraved letters catching the overhead light and reflecting it across the polished surface like a quiet declaration that no one could ignore anymore, and for a moment the room held its breath around it, as if acknowledging that something had just shifted in a way that could not be undone, and Charlotte Whitmore saw it, not just the name, but the way people were looking at it now, not dismissing it, not overlooking it, but reading it, processing it, recalibrating in real time, and that was the first real crack, not in her authority, but in the assumption that her authority had ever been absolute, and she felt it in the subtle change of posture around the table, the way a senior partner who had been leaning back now leaned forward slightly, the way an assistant near the wall stopped pretending to type and instead watched, openly now, waiting, and Charlotte's fingers tightened just slightly against the armrest before relaxing again, her expression still composed, still controlled, but no longer effortless, and she shifted in the chair, just enough to recenter herself, to reclaim the space through posture if not through certainty. "Names can be placed anywhere," she said, her voice smooth, measured, but now carrying a sharper edge, one that sought to re-establish order through logic rather than assumption. "That does not make them accurate." And the statement hung in the air, deliberate, strategic, an attempt to reframe what everyone was beginning to see, to suggest that this was still a misunderstanding, still something that could be corrected without consequence, and for a second it worked, or at least it gave people something familiar to hold on to again, a narrative that did not require them to question their instincts, But Ethan did not react to the challenge in the way she expected. He did not defend the nameplate, did not argue its legitimacy, did not look around the room for support. Instead, he simply straightened slightly, his hand leaving the back of the chair as he stepped half a pace closer, not invading her space, not forcing her to move, but closing the distance just enough that the moment could no longer be avoided or dismissed as abstract. And when he spoke, his voice remained calm, steady, but now there was a quiet finality to it, the kind that does not seek agreement because it does not depend on it. "You are right," he said, and the words landed differently than anyone expected, not as concession, not as retreat, but as something else entirely, something that paused the room in a new way, and Charlotte blinked once, just once, the smallest interruption in her composure, because agreement was not part of the script she had prepared for, and Ethan continued, just as measured, just as precise. "Names can be placed anywhere," he repeated, and then, after a brief pause that stretched just long enough to pull everyone fully into the moment, he added, "But ownership cannot." And the word ownership settled into the room like weight, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, and across the table the senior executive who had been watching his tablet earlier looked up again, this time not with uncertainty but with recognition, his expression shifting in a way that could not be hidden, and he glanced toward another executive, a silent exchange passing between them, quick but clear, and Charlotte saw that too, the shift not just in words but in alignment, and something colder moved beneath her composed exterior, not fear, not yet, but awareness, the kind that arrives just before realization, and she leaned back slightly, as if to create space, to regain perspective, her gaze returning to Ethan with renewed intensity, searching now, not dismissing, trying to understand what she had missed, and for the first time since she sat down, she did not speak immediately, because something in the room had changed in a way that made certainty feel premature, and Ethan did not rush to fill the silence, did not press the advantage, he simply stood there, grounded, patient, allowing the moment to unfold at its own pace, because he knew that what came next did not need to be forced, it only needed to be seen. The word ownership did not echo, it settled, heavy and precise, and for the first time since the meeting began the silence was no longer passive, it was active, pressing against every person in the room, forcing them to reconsider what they thought they understood, and Charlotte Whitmore felt that pressure tighten around her, subtle but undeniable, like a shift in air before a storm that no one had announced yet. And she straightened in the chair, not out of comfort but out of instinct, reclaiming posture where certainty had begun to slip, her chin lifting just slightly as her eyes held on Ethan, sharper now, more focused, no longer dismissing him as an interruption but measuring him as a variable she had not accounted for, and around the table the executives began to move in small, controlled ways, one reaching for a glass of water but stopping halfway, another adjusting the angle of a tablet that no longer held his attention, their actions incomplete, suspended, because the room itself had not decided how to move forward. And then it came, not from Ethan, not from Charlotte, but from the far end of the table, a quiet voice breaking through the stillness. "I think we should verify," the analyst said, his tone careful, respectful, but edged with urgency, and all heads turned, not because of what he said, but because he said it at all, stepping into a space no one else had been willing to enter, and Charlotte's gaze flickered toward him, just for a second, enough to register the shift, enough to recognize that the room was beginning to move without her lead, and that was new, that was unfamiliar, and the analyst's fingers moved quickly now across his keyboard, the soft tapping filling the silence in a way that felt louder than it should, because every keystroke carried implication, and on the screen numbers appeared, documents opened, ownership structures, filings, signatures, details that had always existed but had not been relevant to this moment until now. And Ethan did not look at the screen, did not lean in, did not react, because he already knew what it would show. And that knowledge grounded him in a way that did not require confirmation, and across the table the senior executive leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he read, his expression shifting again, this time not subtle, not hidden, but clear, and he inhaled slowly, as if recalibrating something internal, and Charlotte saw it, saw the change not just in him but in the room as a whole, the quiet alignment beginning to tilt away from her, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that she could feel it. And her fingers tapped once against the armrests before going still again, a controlled movement, but no longer effortless, and she turned back to Ethan, her voice still composed but now carrying a trace of something deeper, something closer to challenge than dismissal. "If you have something to say, then say it clearly," she said, the words precise, deliberate, an attempt to regain control through directness, and for a brief second it seemed like the room paused again, waiting for his response, waiting for the moment to resolve into something recognizable, and Ethan met her gaze, steady, unflinching. And for the first time there was a shift, not in his tone, not in his posture, but in the timing, because he did not respond immediately. He allowed the weight of her words to settle, allowed the room to lean into the expectation, and then, slowly, he stepped forward just enough that the distance between them disappeared entirely, not aggressive, not invasive, but close enough that his next words would not belong to the room. They would belong to her, and the silence tightened, focused, narrowing down to that single point between them, and everything else faded, the table, the screens, the quiet movements at the edges, all of it receding as the moment concentrated, and Ethan leaned slightly, just enough that his voice would not need to carry, just enough that it would remain controlled, contained, intentional, and when he spoke, it was soft, almost quiet, but precise in a way that made it impossible to misunderstand, and in that instant, the balance of the room shifted completely. "You work for me," he said, and the words did not rise above a whisper, but they did not need to, because they landed with a clarity that cut through every layer of assumption in the room, precise, controlled, and impossible to dismiss, and for a fraction of a second Charlotte Whitmore did not react at all, not outwardly, not visibly, her posture still composed, her expression still intact, but something behind her eyes shifted. Something subtle but undeniable, like a recalculation happening. Too fast to be hidden, and the silence that followed was different from before, not tense in the way of uncertainty, but still in the way of recognition, as if the room itself had just understood something all at once, and across the table the analyst's hand stopped moving on the keyboard, frozen mid-motion as the meaning of those words aligned with what he was seeing on the screen, and the senior executive leaned back slowly, exhaling in a way that suggested confirmation rather than surprise. And Charlotte's gaze did not leave Ethan, not yet, because stepping away from that moment would have meant acknowledging it too quickly, and she was not ready for that, not fully, not completely, and so she held her position, her chin level, her shoulders squared, but the stillness in her had changed, no longer effortless, no longer automatic, now deliberate, controlled, as if every small movement required intention. And Ethan straightened again, creating space between them, not as retreat but as closure, the statement complete, the moment delivered, and he did not repeat himself, did not explain, did not elaborate, because he understood that explanation weakens what is already clear, and instead he turned slightly, his attention shifting just enough to acknowledge the rest of the room, and that shift alone was enough to redirect the energy, to pull everyone else into alignment with what had just been established. And the analyst cleared his throat quietly, not to interrupt, but to confirm, his voice careful but steady. "The acquisition was finalized last quarter," he said, eyes still on the screen. "Majority controlling interest transferred through Cole Holdings." And the words moved through the room like a current, connecting what had been said with what had always been true, and one by one the executives adjusted, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, telling ways, a chair repositioned, a posture corrected, a glance redirected toward Ethan rather than Charlotte, subtle signals that the center of authority had shifted, and Charlotte felt all of it, not as a single impact but as a series of quiet realizations stacking one after another, each one reinforcing the same conclusion. And for the first time since she entered the room, she looked down, not fully, not in defeat, but just enough to break the unbroken line of eye contact, her gaze dropping briefly to the nameplate now clearly positioned in front of the chair, the engraved letters catching the light again, no longer ignorable, no longer optional, and her fingers moved slightly against the armrest, a small adjustment, a recalibration of presence, and when she looked back up, her expression had changed, not collapsed, not undone, but altered, the certainty replaced by something more measured, more aware, and the room remained silent, not because no one knew what to say, but because nothing needed to be said, the truth already visible, already understood, and Ethan stepped forward just enough to rest his hand once more on the back of the chair, not claiming it again, not emphasizing it, just returning to where he had always been, steady, composed, and the space around that chair felt different now, not because it had changed, but because everyone finally saw it for what it was. The shift was complete, but no one announced it, no one acknowledged it out loud, because in rooms like this, power did not change with declarations, it changed with behavior, with alignment, with the quiet, almost invisible decisions people made in response to what they now understood, and Charlotte Whitmore felt that shift settle around her like a temperature drop she could not ignore, not sudden, not dramatic, but steady, undeniable, and for the first time she became aware of the chair beneath her, not as a symbol of control, but as a position she was occupying without permission, and that awareness altered everything, the way her shoulders held tension, the way her breath slowed just slightly, the way her eyes moved again, not to challenge, but to reassess, and across the table the senior executive who had been watching the documents straightened fully now, his posture aligning with Ethan rather than her, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but clear in its meaning, and another executive followed, turning his body just enough to face Ethan more directly, not waiting for instruction, not seeking approval, simply adjusting to the reality that had been revealed, and even the assistants along the wall shifted, their attention no longer divided, no longer cautious, now focused, unified. And Charlotte noticed all of it, every subtle realignment, every quiet signal that the room had moved without her, and for a brief moment something sharp flickered beneath her composed exterior, not anger, not embarrassment, but the instinctive resistance of someone who had always controlled the narrative and now found herself inside one she did not write, and she inhaled slowly, deliberately, grounding herself in the only thing she still controlled, her response, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, not weaker, but measured in a different way, stripped of performance. "If that is the case," she said, her words careful, precise, "then it appears I have been working with incomplete information." And the statement did not concede fully, but it did something more important, it acknowledged the shift without collapsing under it, and that acknowledgement rippled through the room, easing the tension just enough to allow movement again, and Ethan listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, not satisfied, not vindictive, just present, and when she finished, he gave a small nod, not exaggerated, not theatrical, just enough to confirm that he had heard her, and that the moment did not require escalation, and then he moved, finally, pulling the chair back the rest of the way, the motion smooth, unhurried, as if it had always been leading to this point, and Charlotte felt it before she decided it, the need to stand, not because she was told, not because she was forced, but because remaining seated no longer aligned with the truths she now understood, and she rose, controlled, composed, her movements deliberate, preserving dignity even as the dynamic shifted, and the room watched, not with judgment, not with spectacle, but with a quiet awareness that something meaningful had just taken place, something beyond hierarchy, beyond titles, something closer to clarity, and Ethan stepped forward, not immediately sitting, not rushing to occupy the space, but pausing for a fraction of a second, allowing the transition to complete fully, and in that pause, there was no triumph, no display, only stillness, and then he took his seat, calm, grounded, his presence settling into the chair not as a claim, but as a return, and around the table the executives adjusted again, this time in unison, their attention aligning naturally, conversations unspoken but understood, and Charlotte remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, her gaze steady, her posture intact. And then she moved to the side, not retreating, not diminished, but repositioned, aware now of the difference between proximity to power and possession of it, and the room, finally, began to breathe again. The room did not return to normal, it reshaped itself, slowly, deliberately, like a structure adjusting to a new foundation, and Ethan Coles sat at the head of the table with a quiet presence that did not demand attention yet held it completely, his hands resting lightly on the surface, his posture relaxed but precise, and the shift in energy was immediate, not loud, not forced, but undeniable. Conversations that had been waiting beneath the silence now found direction, papers were straightened. Screens were turned toward him instead of away, and the rhythm of the room began again, this time aligned with something real, and Charlotte Whitmore stood just off to the side for a moment longer, not frozen, not uncertain, but recalibrating, her mind moving quickly through what had just happened, not searching for escape, but for understanding, because what unsettled her was not the outcome. It was the realization that she had misread the entire structure from the beginning, and that realization required more than a simple reaction, it required adjustment, and she made it, step by step, controlled, composed, walking to an open seat along the side of the table, not hesitating, not drawing attention, simply repositioning herself within the reality that had been revealed, and when she sat, it was with the same level of presence she had carried before, but now directed differently. No longer assuming authority, but engaging with it, and across from her, one of the executives began to speak, carefully at first, outlining projections, timelines, numbers that had been prepared for a different kind of meeting, but now took on new weight under Ethan's quiet leadership, and he listened, not interrupting, not asserting unnecessarily, just absorbing, processing, his gaze moving between speakers with calm focus, and when he did respond, it was concise, measured, asking questions that cut directly to the core of the discussion, not to challenge, but to refine, and each response reinforced what the room was already beginning to accept, that his authority was not situational, not symbolic, but earned, structured, and real, and Charlotte watched that, not defensively, not dismissively, but analytically, her attention sharpened, her posture slightly forward now, engaged in a way she had not been before. Because for the first time she was not navigating a room she already understood, she was learning one in real time, and that shift in her perspective did not go unnoticed. The senior executive glanced toward her once, then back to Ethan, acknowledging both positions without conflict, and the tension that had filled the room earlier did not return, it dissolved into something more stable, more grounded, a sense of clarity that allowed movement without resistance, and Ethan's hand moved once, lightly, adjusting a document in front of him, the small action steady, controlled, and it anchored the moment, a physical reminder that everything had settled into place, and Charlotte exhaled quietly, not in relief, but in acceptance, her eyes moving briefly to the nameplate at the head of the table, then back to Ethan, and this time there was no challenge in her gaze, no assumption, only recognition, and in that recognition something shifted again, not in the room, but within her. A recalibration of how she would move forward from this moment, and she straightened slightly, her voice entering the conversation once more, not to reclaim what had passed, but to contribute to what was now unfolding, and the room received it without hesitation, because the hierarchy was no longer in question, and neither was her place within it, and for the first time since the meeting began, everything moved without friction. The meeting moved forward, steady and composed, but something deeper had already settled beneath it, something that would remain long after the numbers were reviewed and the projections finalized, and as the final report was closed and the last voice in the room faded into silence, Ethan Cole leaned back slightly in his chair, not in exhaustion, not in relief, but in quiet completion. His presence unchanged from the moment he first stepped into the room, grounded, deliberate, and the executives followed his lead without needing instruction, laptops closed one by one, papers aligned into neat stacks, chairs shifting softly against the floor as the structure of the meeting dissolved into its conclusion, and Charlotte Whitmore remained seated for a moment longer than the others, her hands resting lightly on the table, her gaze lowered just enough to catch the reflection of the overhead light across the polished surface, and in that reflection she saw more than the room, she saw the moment that had redefined it, not as a loss, not as a failure, but as a correction, a realignment of perception with truth, and she inhaled slowly, the breath measured, intentional, before lifting her gaze again, this time not searching, not questioning, but clear, and she stood smooth, composed, her posture as precise as it had been when she first entered, but now carrying a different weight, one shaped by awareness rather than assumption, and as people began to move toward the exit, quiet conversations forming in low tones, she stepped forward. Not into the center of the room, not into the spotlight, but toward Ethan. Her movement calm, unhurried, and when she stopped beside him, she did not reach for attention, did not wait for acknowledgement from others, she simply spoke, her voice steady, direct. "I misread the room," she said, the words simple, unadorned, carrying no defensiveness, no performance, only clarity, and for a moment the space around them softened, the tension that had once defined their interaction now replaced with something more grounded, more human, and Ethan looked up at her, his expression unchanged in its calm, but there was something else there now, something quieter, something that recognized the shift she had made, and he gave a small nod, not as validation, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, and that was enough, more than enough, and Charlotte held his gaze for a brief second longer before stepping back, not retreating, not diminished, but moving forward with a clearer understanding of where she stood. And as she turned to leave, the room continued to empty. Footsteps soft against the floor, voices fading into the hallway beyond, until only the quiet remained, and Ethan stayed where he was for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the table, the nameplate in front of him catching the last angle of light from the chandelier above, steady, unchanged, and in that stillness there was no need for words, no need for reinforcement, because everything that needed to be understood had already been seen, already been felt, and as he finally stood, adjusting his jacket with a small, precise movement, the room did not echo with what had happened, it held it, quietly, like a space that had witnessed something true and did not need to explain it, and when the door closed behind him, the silence that remained was not empty, it was complete.